Midnight in Kentucky, 1834. The world outside is a black, howling void, rain lashing the roof of a lonely log cabin perched on the edge of the wild. Inside, the air is thick with the scent of sweat, fear, and something else, something metallic, almost electric. A woman's cries rise and fall, muffled by the storm. As her husband paces the floor, boots thudding against rough-hewn planks. In the corner, a doctor, his face gaunt, eyes hollowed by sleeplessness, fumbles with his bag, hands trembling not from age, but from a dread he cannot name. Lightning splits the sky, illuminating the cramped room in a flash of blue-white. For a moment, everything is frozen. The mother's agony, the father's helplessness, the doctor's silent prayer. Then, with a final, shuddering scream, the first child is born. The doctor lifts the infant, his breath catching as he glimpses the tiny, perfect face. Relief flickers in his eyes till the second cry pierces the night. Twins, but as the second child emerges, the doctor recoils. His hands shake so violently he nearly drops the newborn. The father, desperate, demands to see his children, but the doctor hesitates, his lips pressed into a bloodless line. What he has seen, what he will never speak of, will haunt him for the rest of his days. This is the story of Kentucky's twin mystery, a case that would baffle science, terrify a community, and leave a stain on the land that no rain could ever wash away. Most have never heard this story. Those who have never forget it. Tonight, you'll discover why. But be warned, some secrets are not meant to be unearthed. Kentucky in the 1830s was a land of contradictions, a place where the wildness of the frontier pressed up against the fragile order of civilization. The rolling hills and dense forests seemed, at first glance, to promise peace and plenty. In spring, the meadows blushed with wildflowers, and the air was thick with the scent of honeysuckle and the low hum of bees. Children ran barefoot through fields, their laughter echoing between the trees, while their parents toiled in the earth, coaxing life from stubborn soil. The rivers, broad and slow, carried secrets downstream, past cabins and cornfields, past the silent, watching woods. But beneath this pastoral surface, a different current ran. The land was old, older than the settlers who claimed it, and the forests held memories that no plough could erase. At night, the wind carried strange sound cries that might be foxes, or something else entirely. The darkness pressed close, thick and absolute, broken only by the flicker of lanterns in distant windows. For every story of bounty, there was another whispered in the hush of evening, tales of things seen in the woods, of children lost and never found, of curses that clung to families like a second skin. Isolation was a fact of life. Neighbors might live miles apart, separated by tangled thickets and muddy creeks. A journey to the nearest town could take a day or more. And in the depths of winter, the roads vanished beneath drifts of snow and ice. News traveled slowly, carried by travelers or the rare newspaper, and rumors grew in the silence, twisting into something darker with each retelling. In this world, the unknown was not an abstract idea, was a living presence, lurking just beyond the circle of firelight. Superstition thrived in the gaps left by ignorance. The Bible was read by candlelight, its words a shield against the terrors of the night. But old beliefs lingered, stubborn as weeds. Some families hung horseshoes above their doors to ward off evil. Others whispered charms over their children's cribs. A sudden illness, a failed crop, a stillbirth. These were not just misfortunes, but signs, warnings from a world that was always watching. The line between faith and fear was thin and often blurred. Yet, even as the old ways clung to life, a new force was stirring. Science, with its promise of reason and order, was making its slow, halting way into the Kentucky hills. Traveling doctors brought with them strange instruments and stranger ideas, talk of germs, of anatomy, of causes, and cures that had nothing to do with curses or the will of God. Some welcomed these men of learning, desperate for relief from suffering. Others eyed them with suspicion, muttering that too much knowledge was a dangerous thing. The community at the heart of our story was no different. By day, its people worked and worshipped, their lives bound by the rhythms of the land and the church bell. By night, they locked their doors and prayed that nothing would come knocking. They were proud, resilient, and wary of outsiders. They knew the land could be generous, but also cruel. They had seen too many things that could not be explained: strange lights in the woods, animals born wrong, dreams that left a mark on waking life. Fear of the unknown was a constant companion. It shaped the way people spoke, the way they treated strangers, the way they explained the unexplainable. When something strange happened, child falling ill, a cow refusing to give milk, the community gathered in tight, anxious knots, trading stories and suspicions. Sometimes the fear turned inward, and neighbors became enemies. Other times it turned outward, seeking a scapegoat, a reason, a pattern in the chaos. It was into this world half lit by faith, half shadowed by doubt that the twins were born. Their arrival would shatter the uneasy balance, forcing the community to confront the darkness they had always sensed, but never dared to name. The innocence of the landscape was only a mask, and beneath it, something ancient and hungry waited. The people of Kentucky had always feared the unknown. Now, the unknown had come home. The McCreary family had always been considered fortunate by the standards of their neighbors. Their cabin, though modest, stood on a rise above the creek, its walls sturdy and its roof patched with care. John McCreary was a man of quiet strength, his hands calloused from years of coaxing corn and tobacco from the stubborn Kentucky earth. He was not a man given to superstition, at least not openly, and he carried himself with the steady assurance of someone who believed in hard work and the providence of God. His wife, Mary, was known for her gentle spirit and her skill with herbs and remedies, a gift passed down from her mother and her mother before her. Together, they had built a life that, if not easy, was at least their own. Their first two children, both boys, had survived the perils of infancy, blessing in a land where so many graves were dug small. The McCrearys were not wealthy, but their table was never empty, and their laughter, though sometimes tinged with weariness, filled the cabin on long winter nights. They dreamed, as all parents do, of a future brighter than their own, a daughter to help Mary in the garden, perhaps, or another strong son to share the burden of the fields. When Mary's belly began to swell again in the spring of 1834, the family's hopes grew with it. But as the months passed, Mary's pregnancy became a source of quiet concern. She grew larger than she had with her previous children, her movements slow and heavy, her face drawn with exhaustion. The local women whispered that she was carrying twins, a rare and risky prospect in those days, when childbirth was a gamble and every birth a brush with death. Mary tried to hide her fear, but John saw it in the way her hands lingered on her swollen belly, in the way she stared out the window at the gathering dusk. The night of the birth arrived with a violence that seemed almost prophetic. A storm rolled in from the west, thunder shaking the cabin's timbers, rain drumming against the roof in relentless waves. The air inside was thick and close, the fire in the hearth throwing wild shadows across the walls. Mary's labor began at dusk, her cries muffled by the storm, her body racked with pain that came in relentless waves. John sent their eldest son to fetch the doctor, a journey that took him through mud and darkness, his lantern a feeble glow against the night. The doctor arrived near midnight, soaked to the bone, his face pale beneath the brim of his hat. He set his bag on the table. With shaking hands, his eyes flicking to Mary, then to John, then back again. The room was a world unto itself, cut off from the storm and the rest of humanity, a place where time stretched and contracted. measured only by the rhythm of Mary's breathing and the ticking of the old clock on the mantel. Mary's pain grew sharper, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. John knelt beside her, his hand clasping hers, whispering prayers he had not spoken since he was a boy. The doctor worked in silence, his movements practiced but tense, sweat beading on his brow despite the chill in the air. The smell of blood and fear mingled with the scent of wet earth and wood smoke, filling the cabin with a primal, animal energy. At last, with a final, shuddering effort, Mary brought forth the first child, a girl, small and perfect, her cries piercing the storm. Relief swept through the room, and for a moment, hope returned. The doctor handed the infant to Mary, who cradled her daughter with trembling arms, tears streaming down her face. John pressed a kiss to Mary's forehead, his own eyes shining with gratitude, but the respite was brief. Mary's pain did not subside. Instead, it sharpened, twisting her body with renewed force. The doctor's expression darkened as he realized what was happening. Another child was coming, and this one did not arrive easily. The minutes dragged on, each one heavier than the last, the storm outside rising to a fever pitch. When the second twin finally emerged, the doctor's hands faltered. The child was silent at first, its skin pale and slick, its limbs oddly twisted. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the infant drew a breath, a thin, reedy sound that sent a chill through the room. The doctor's face was ashen as he rapped. The child in a blanket, his eyes refusing to meet John's. Mary, exhausted and delirious, reached for her second child, but the doctor hesitated. John, sensing something was wrong, demanded to see his son. The doctor relented, placing the infant in John's arms. The boy's eyes were open, wide and unblinking, his gaze unsettling in its intensity. His tiny fingers curled and uncurled, grasping at the air as if searching for something just out of reach. In that moment, a shadow seemed to fall across the room, the firelight flickering as if in warning. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cabin, a deeper storm had begun, a storm that would not pass with the dawn. The McCrearys, once so full of hope, now found themselves standing at the threshold of a mystery that would test the limits of their faith, their love, and their very sanity. The birth of the twins was not an ending, but a beginning, a doorway opening onto darkness, and a secret that would haunt them all. In the first days after the birth, the McCreary cabin was filled with a hush that was not quite peace. Mary, pale and spent, drifted in and out of sleep, her arms cradling the twins as if by holding them close she could keep the world at bay. The girl, whom they named Eliza, was a quiet, contented infant, her cries soft and easily soothed. She nursed eagerly, her tiny hands clutching at Mary's dress, her eyes bright and curious even in those earliest hours. The boy, whom they named Ephraim, was different from the start. At first, it was only the physical differences that set Ephraim apart. His skin, though warm to the touch, had a pallor that never quite faded, a bluish cast that deepened in the shadows. His limbs, though strong, seemed to move with a strange stiffness, his fingers curling and uncurling in restless, jerky motions. His eyes wide, unblinking, a shade to dark, seemed to follow things that no one else could see, tracking invisible patterns across the ceiling or staring, unblinking, into the corners of the room. When he cried, the sound was thin and high, a note that set Mary's teeth on edge and made John's heart race with a fear he could not name. The neighbors, when they came to offer their congratulations, noticed the differences too. They exchanged glances over the cradle, their smiles tight and brittle. One old woman, her face lined with years and worry, muttered a prayer under her breath and pressed a sprig of rosemary into Mary's hand for protection. Mary thanked her, but the gesture left her unsettled. She began to keep the twins close, reluctant to let them out of her sight, as if she feared the world might snatch them away, or worse, that something inside the house might change them. As the days turned to weeks, the differences between Eliza and Ephraim grew more pronounced. Eliza thrived, her cheeks rosy, her laughter bubbling up like spring water. She reached for her mother, for her brothers, for the sunlight that streamed through the window. Ephraim, by contrast, seemed to shrink from the light, his eyes watering in the brightness, his cries growing louder and more insistent as the day wore on. At night, when the house was quiet and the others slept, Mary would find him awake, staring at the ceiling, his tiny fists clenched tight. There were other things, too small, inexplicable occurrences that began to accumulate like dust in the corners. Toys left in the cradle with Ephraim would be found on the floor, arranged in strange, deliberate patterns. The family cat, usually bold and affectionate, refused to enter the room where the twins slept, arching its back and hissing at the door. Sometimes, in the dead of night, John would wake to the sound of whisperings, oft, urgent, just beyond the edge of hearing. He would rise, heart pounding, and find Mary sitting by the cradle, her face drawn and haunted, her eyes fixed on Ephraim. Mary tried to dismiss these things as the fancies of an overtired mind, the natural anxieties of a mother with 2 new infants. But the feeling of unease grew, a slow, creeping dread that settled over the household like a shroud. She began to keep a lamp burning through the night, its feeble glow a small comfort against the darkness. She hung the old woman's rosemary above the door and whispered prayers over her children as they slept. John, too, felt the change in the air. He threw himself into his work, spending long hours in the fields. But the sense of something wrong lingered, following him like a shadow. He found himself snapping at the older boys, his patience worn thin by sleepless nights and the constant, inexplicable tension in the house. He tried to reassure Mary, to tell her that all babies were different, that Ephraim would grow out of his odd ways. But even as he spoke the words, he felt the lie in them. The doctor, when he returned to check on Mary and the twins, was more reserved than before. He examined Ephraim with careful, clinical detachment, his fingers probing the child's limbs, his eyes lingering on the boy's face a moment too long. He asked questions about Ephraim's sleep, his feeding, his cries, but his tone was distant, almost distracted. When he left, he pressed John's hand in both of his grip tight and lingering. "If you notice anything unusual," he said, his voice low, "send for me at once." That night, after the house had finally fallen silent, the doctor sat at his desk by candlelight, his journal open before him. He dipped his pen in ink, hesitated, then began to write in a cramped, hurried script. June 14th, 1834, visited. McCreary family. Twins progressing, but male child Ephraim displays anomalies I cannot explain. Skin pallor persists. Eyes unsettling. Mother reports disturbances at night. Objects moved. Cat refuses proximity. No fever, no sign of illness. Yet I cannot shake the feeling that something is amiss. There is a presence in that house. Something unnatural. Will monitor closely. Must not alarm the family. God help us if my suspicions prove true. He closed the journal with a trembling hand, the candle flickering as if in warning. In the darkness, the secrets of the McCreary twins pressed in, silent and waiting. In a place as close-knit and isolated as the McCreary's corner of Kentucky, secrets were as rare as gold. News, even the kind best left unspoken, travelled on the wind, carried by the creak of wagon wheels, the hush of church pews, and the low voices that gathered at dusk on front porches. It was not long before the story of the twins and the strange happenings in the McCreary cabin began to ripple through the community. At first, the talk was gentle, almost sympathetic. The birth of twins was a rare event, and the neighbors brought gifts of bread and preserves, their faces bright with forced cheer. But beneath the surface, unease simmered. The old women, who remembered every odd birth and every bad year, exchanged glances over their knitting. The men, who prided themselves on their reason, found themselves pausing in their work, listening for the faintest echo of something amiss. It was the children who spoke most freely. They whispered of the McCreary twins as if they were characters in a cautionary tale. Some claimed to have seen Ephraim's eyes glowing in the dark, or to have heard him speaking in a language no one understood. Others swore that the family's cat had run off for good, and that the birds no longer sang near the McCreary fields. The stories grew with each telling, fed by fear and the thrill of the forbidden. Sunday brought the community together in the small clapboard church at the edge of the woods. The preacher, a stern man with a voice like thunder, spoke of trials and tribulations, of the need for faith in the face of adversity. But even as he thundered from the pulpit, his eyes flicked to the McCrearys, lingering a moment too long on Mary's pale face and John's clenched jaw. After the service, the congregation gathered in tight knots, their voices low and urgent. "Did you see the way that boy looked at me?" One woman whispered, her hand pressed to her chest, "like he could see right through me." "It's not natural, the way he never cries in church," another replied. "Babies are supposed to fuss. That one just stares." The doctor, who sat near the back, listened in silence. He had tried to reassure the family, to explain Ephraim's differences in the language of science, perhaps a touch of jaundice, or a mild palsy, or simply the quirks of a difficult birth. But his words fell flat against the weight of old beliefs. The people of the valley had seen too much to trust easily in new ideas. They remembered stories of changelings and witches, of children born under unlucky stars. As the weeks passed, the rumors grew darker. Some said the twins were a punishment, a sign that the McCrearys had angered God. Others whispered that Mary had meddled with things best left alone, that her knowledge of herbs and old remedies was a mark of witchcraft. A few, emboldened by fear, began to avoid the family altogether, crossing the road rather than pass their gate, refusing to buy John's corn at market. The tension between faith and science became a fault line running through the heart of the community. The preacher urged his flock to pray for the McCrearys, to trust in God's plan, but his words were laced with warnings. "The devil walks among us," he intoned one Sunday, his gaze sweeping the pews. "He seeks to sow confusion and fear." We must be vigilant. The doctor, for his part, grew more isolated. He kept his observations to himself, unwilling to stoke the flames of superstition, but the strain showed in his face. He spent long hours in his study, poring over medical texts, searching for an explanation that would satisfy both his mind and his conscience. He found none. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills and the shadows lengthened, a group of men gathered outside the general store. They spoke in low voices, their faces grim. "I heard the baby's got the mark," one said, tapping his temple, a sign of the old country. "My grandmother used to say, 'Don't start with that nonsense,'" another interrupted, though his voice trembled. "It's just a sickly child. Happens all the time." "Then why does the doctor look so worried?" A third man asked. "Why won't he say what's wrong?" The conversation circled, never settling, each man caught between what he knew and what he feared. The line between science and superstition blurred, and in that space, the unknown grew monstrous. Mary felt the weight of the community's suspicion most keenly. She saw it in the way the women turned away when she entered a room, in the way the children stared at Ephraim with wide, frightened eyes. She clung to her faith, praying over her children each night, but doubt crept in like a chill. She remembered her mother's stories of spirits and omens, of the thin places where the world grew strange. She wondered, in her darkest moments, if she had crossed some invisible line. John, too, was torn. He wanted to believe the doctor, to trust in reason and the promise of science, but the evidence of his own eyes was hard to ignore. He saw the way Ephraim's shadow seemed to linger a moment too long, the way the boy's gaze unsettled even the bravest men. He heard the whispers, felt the isolation closing in around his family like a noose. The McCrearys stood at the center of a storm, battered by forces they could not control. The community, once a source of comfort, had become a crucible, testing the limits of faith, reason, and love. The twins, innocent and unknowing, were the axis on which the whole world seemed to turn. And so, I ask you, if you lived in Kentucky in 1834, would you trust the doctor's science or the old superstitions whispered in the dark? Would you cling to reason or give in to fear? Let me know in the comments, because sometimes the line between the two is thinner than we care to admit. Summer in Kentucky is a season of heavy air and restless nights, when the world seems to hold its breath beneath a sky swollen with thunder. For the McCreary family, that summer became a season of dread, a slow, suffocating descent into fear that no prayer or reason could dispel. It began with small things, the kind that could be explained away if one tried hard enough. Eliza, always robust, began to suffer from fevers that came and went with no pattern. Her skin would flush, her breath quicken, and then, as suddenly as it began, the illness would vanish, leaving her weak and trembling. Ephraim, meanwhile, grew quieter, his cries fading to a near silence. He would lie in his cradle for hours, eyes wide open, watching the shadows crawl across the ceiling. Sometimes, Mary would find him sitting up, impossibly still, his gaze fixed on a corner of the room where the light never seemed to reach. The house itself seemed to change. Doors that had always stayed shut would swing open in the night, letting in draughts of cold air that smelled of earth and rot. The fire in the hearth, once a comfort, now sputtered and smoked, filling the cabin with a haze that stung the eyes and clung to the skin. Objects disappeared: spoons, a pair of Mary's knitting needles, a silver locket that had belonged to her mother, only to reappear days later in strange places beneath the twins' cradle, in the ashes of the hearth, or outside on the muddy path leading to the woods. John tried to keep the farm running, but the land itself seemed to rebel. Crops withered overnight, their leaves curling and blackening as if touched by frost. The cow, once docile, grew skittish, refusing to enter the barn and bellowing at nothing in the darkness. The chickens stopped laying, and the family's dog, old and loyal, vanished one night without a trace. Each loss was a blow, chipping away at the fragile hope that had once filled the McCreary home. Mary's health began to fail. She grew thin and hollow-eyed, her hands trembling as she moved. Through her days, she spoke less, her voice barely more than a whisper, and spent long hours sitting by the twins' cradle, her gaze distant and unfocused. She began to dream of water dark, cold, and endless rising up to swallow the house. She would wake in the night, heart pounding, certain that something was watching her from the shadows. The doctor visited more frequently, his concern deepening with each call. He examined the twins, his hands gentle but his eyes troubled. He prescribed tonics and poultices, but nothing seemed to help. He spoke in hushed tones to John, warning him to keep the children warm, to watch for signs of infection, but his words rang hollow. There was a look in his eyes, a flicker of fear that he could not hide. The community's suspicion hardened into hostility. Neighbors stopped visiting altogether. The preacher, once a source of comfort, now avoided the McCreary pew on Sundays, his sermons growing more dire with each passing week. "The wages of sin is death," he thundered, his voice echoing through the church. "We must root out evil, wherever it hides." The message was clear, and the congregation responded with silence and sidelong glances. Children were forbidden to play near the McCreary farm. At the market, John found himself shunned, his produce left unsold, his greetings met with cold stares. The family became ghosts in their own community, moving through the world unseen and unwanted. The isolation was complete, and with it came a new kind of terror, the fear that they were truly alone, that no one would help them if the worst should come. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere grew oppressive. The air was thick with unspoken words, with secrets and suspicions that no one dared voice. Eliza's fevers grew more frequent, her body racked with chills that left her limp and unresponsive. Ephraim, in contrast, seemed untouched by illness, but his behavior grew stranger. He would sit for hours, staring at the same spot on the wall, his lips moving in silent conversation. Sometimes, Mary would hear him laugh a low, guttural sound that did not belong in the mouth of a child. One night, as a storm raged outside, Mary awoke to find Ephraim standing at the foot of her bed, his eyes reflecting the lightning that flashed through the window. He reached out a hand, his fingers cold and damp, and whispered her name. She screamed, waking John, who rushed to her side. But when he looked, Ephraim was gone, tucked safely in his cradle, his breathing slow and even. Mary's terror was dismissed as a nightmare, but the fear lingered, gnawing at her sanity. The doctor's journal grew darker with each entry. "The boy is not like other children," he wrote. "There is a presence about him, intelligence, or perhaps a malice that I cannot explain. The mother is failing. The father is desperate. I fear for them all." The final straw came when the preacher, emboldened by the community's fear, called for a meeting. The townsfolk gathered in the church, their faces grim and resolute. "We must protect ourselves," the preacher declared. "We must not allow evil to take root among us." There were murmurs of agreement, and a decision was made. The McCrearys would be left to their fate. No one would visit, no one would help. The family was cut off, abandoned to the darkness that had claimed their home. In the days that followed, the McCreary cabin became a place of silence and shadows. The twins, once a symbol of hope, were now the center of a storm that threatened to destroy everything in its path. The family's world had shrunk to the four walls of their home, and within those walls, the horror only deepened. The descent had begun, and there was no turning back. Summer in Kentucky is a season of heavy air and restless nights, when the world seems to hold its breath beneath a sky swollen with thunder. For the McCreary family, that summer became a season of dread, a slow, suffocating descent into fear that no prayer or reason could dispel. It began with small things, the kind that could be explained away if one tried hard enough. Eliza, always robust, began to suffer from fevers that came and went with no pattern. Her skin would flush, her breath quicken, and then, as suddenly as it began, the illness would vanish, leaving her weak and trembling. Ephraim, meanwhile, grew quieter, his cries fading to a near silence. He would lie in his cradle for hours, eyes wide open, watching the shadows crawl across the ceiling. Sometimes, Mary would find him sitting up, impossibly still, his gaze fixed on a corner of the room where the light never seemed to reach. The house itself seemed to change. Doors that had always stayed shut would swing open in the night, letting in draughts of cold air that smelled of earth and rot. The fire in the hearth, once a comfort, now sputtered and smoked, filling the cabin with a haze that stung the eyes and clung to the skin. Objects disappeared: spoons, a pair of Mary's knitting needles, a silver locket that had belonged to her mother, only to reappear days later in strange places beneath the twins' cradle, in the ashes of the hearth, or outside on the muddy path leading to the woods. John tried to keep the farm running, but the land itself seemed to rebel. Crops withered overnight, their leaves curling and blackening as if touched by frost. The cow, once docile, grew skittish, refusing to enter the barn and bellowing at nothing in the darkness. The chickens stopped laying, and the family's dog, old and loyal, vanished one night without a trace. Each loss was a blow, chipping away at the fragile hope that had once filled the McCreary home. Mary's health began to fail. She grew thin and hollow-eyed, her hands trembling as she moved. Through her days, she spoke less, her voice barely more than a whisper, and spent long hours sitting by the twins' cradle, her gaze distant and unfocused. She began to dream of water dark, cold, and endless rising up to swallow the house. She would wake in the night, heart pounding, certain that something was watching her from the shadows. The doctor visited more frequently, his concern deepening with each call. He examined the twins, his hands gentle but his eyes troubled. He prescribed tonics and poultices, but nothing seemed to help. He spoke in hushed tones to John, warning him to keep the children warm, to watch for signs of infection, but his words rang hollow. There was a look in his eyes, a flicker of fear that he could not hide. The community's suspicion hardened into hostility. Neighbors stopped visiting altogether. The preacher, once a source of comfort, now avoided the McCreary pew on Sundays, his sermons growing more dire with each passing week. "The wages of sin is death," he thundered, his voice echoing through the church. "We must root out evil, wherever it hides." The message was clear, and the congregation responded with silence and sidelong glances. Children were forbidden to play near the McCreary farm. At the market, John found himself shunned, his produce left unsold, his greetings met with cold stares. The family became ghosts in their own community, moving through the world unseen and unwanted. The isolation was complete, and with it came a new kind of terror, the fear that they were truly alone, that no one would help them if the worst should come. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere grew oppressive. The air was thick with unspoken words, with secrets and suspicions that no one dared voice. Eliza's fevers grew more frequent, her body racked with chills that left her limp and unresponsive. Ephraim, in contrast, seemed untouched by illness, but his behavior grew stranger. He would sit for hours, staring at the same spot on the wall, his lips moving in silent conversation. Sometimes, Mary would hear him laugh a low, guttural sound that did not belong in the mouth of a child. One night, as a storm raged outside, Mary awoke to find Ephraim standing at the foot of her bed, his eyes reflecting the lightning that flashed through the window. He reached out a hand, his fingers cold and damp, and whispered her name. She screamed, waking John, who rushed to her side. But when he looked, Ephraim was gone, tucked safely in his cradle, his breathing slow and even. Mary's terror was dismissed as a nightmare, but the fear lingered, gnawing at her sanity. The doctor's journal grew darker with each entry. "The boy is not like other children," he wrote. "There is a presence about him, intelligence, or perhaps a malice that I cannot explain. The mother is failing. The father is desperate. I fear for them all." The final straw came when the preacher, emboldened by the community's fear, called for a meeting. The townsfolk gathered in the church, their faces grim and resolute. "We must protect ourselves," the preacher declared. "We must not allow evil to take root among us." There were murmurs of agreement, and a decision was made. The McCrearys would be left to their fate. No one would visit, no one would help. The family was cut off, abandoned to the darkness that had claimed their home. In the days that followed, the McCreary cabin became a place of silence and shadows. The twins, once a symbol of hope, were now the center of a storm that threatened to destroy everything in its path. The family's world had shrunk to the four walls of their home, and within those walls, the horror only deepened. The descent had begun, and there was no turning back. The McCreary family's isolation, once a matter of geography, had become a prison of fear and suspicion. Yet even as the community turned its back, the mystery of the twins began to draw the attention of outsiders, men of science, curiosity, and, in some cases, ambition. Word of the strange happenings at the McCreary cabin traveled farther than the family could have imagined, carried by the doctor's discreet inquiries and the fevered whispers of those who still dared to speak of the twins. The first to arrive was Dr. Silas Wainwright, a physician from Lexington with a reputation for both brilliance and arrogance. He came at the urging of the local doctor, who, despite his own growing dread, still clung to the hope that reason might prevail. Wainwright arrived in a cloud of dust, his carriage drawn by a pair of nervous horses, his eyes sharp and hungry for answers. He brought with him a leather case filled with instrument stethoscopes, calipers, glass vials, and a notebook in which he recorded every detail with meticulous care. Wainwright's approach was clinical, almost cold. He examined Ephraim and Eliza with the detachment of a man studying rare specimens. He measured their limbs, peered into their eyes, listened to their hearts. He questioned Mary and John at length, probing for any detail that might explain the children's differences. He noted the pallor of Ephraim's skin, the peculiar stiffness of his joints, the way his gaze seemed to pierce through the people around him. He observed Eliza's fevers, her sudden chills, her rapid recoveries. After several days, Wainwright gathered the family and the local doctor in the cramped parlor. He spoke with the authority of a man who believed in the power of knowledge. There are cases, he explained, of twins born with what we now call congenital anomalies. It is possible that Ephraim suffers from a rare disorder, perhaps a form of paralysis or a neurological condition not yet understood. The girl's fevers may be unrelated, or they may share a common cause. There is no evidence of contagion, no sign of infection. I see nothing here that cannot, in time, be explained by science. His words were meant to reassure, but they rang hollow in the shadowed room. Mary clung to Eliza, her eyes haunted. John stared at the floor, his jaw clenched. The local doctor, who had seen things he could not explain, said nothing. Left as quickly as he had come, his notes tucked away, his curiosity sated. He would later publish a brief account of the case in a medical journal, describing the twins as an unusual but not unprecedented example of congenital divergence. He did not mention the missing objects, the strange patterns in the dust, or the way the air in the cabin seemed to thicken with every passing day. But not all who came were men of science. The next visitor was a woman, old Mrs. Abernathy, known in the region as a healer, a midwife, and, to some, a witch. She arrived unannounced, her arrival marked by the barking of dogs and the sudden hush of birds. She carried a basket of herbs and a bundle of dried lavender, her eyes sharp and knowing. Mrs. Abernathy moved through the house with the confidence of someone who had seen much and feared little. She examined the twins, her hands gentle but firm. She muttered prayers under her breath, sprinkled salt at the thresholds, and hung sprigs of rosemary above the doors. She spoke to Mary in hushed tones, asking about dreams, about omens, about the history of the land. There are places, she said, her voice low and grave, where the veil is thin, where things slip through that do not belong. Sometimes children are born touched by that other world. It is not their fault, nor yours, but you must be careful. There are forces here that do not wish to be named. John bristled at her words, his faith in reason warring with the fear that had taken root in his heart. We are good people, he insisted. We have done nothing to deserve this. Mrs. Abernathy looked at him with pity. Sometimes it is not about what we deserve. Sometimes it is simply about where we are and what we do when the darkness comes. Her visit left the family more unsettled than before. Mary clung to the old woman's charms, hanging them in every room, while John grew more withdrawn, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. The twins, oblivious to the storm around them, continued in their strange ways, Liza drifting in and out of fevered sleep, Ephraim watching, always watching. The local doctor, caught between the worlds of science and superstition, began to keep his own counsel. He wrote long letters to colleagues in distant cities, describing the case in careful, measured terms. He received replies filled with speculation. Some suggested rare diseases. Others hinted at psychological disturbances. A few dismissed the entire affair as the product of rural ignorance and hysteria. But the doctor knew what he had seen. He knew the weight of the silence in the McCreary home, the way the shadows seemed to move of their own accord. He knew the fear in Mary's eyes, the desperation in John's voice. He began to question his own beliefs, to wonder if there were things in the world that science could not yet explain. The community, meanwhile, grew more divided. Some clung to the preacher's warnings, convinced that the twins were a sign of God's wrath or the devil's handiwork. Others whispered that the family was cursed, that the land itself was tainted. A few, remembering Mrs. Abernathy's words, left offerings at the edge of the McCreary property, bundles of herbs, small tokens, prayers scrawled on scraps of paper. The McCrearys, caught in the crossfire, could do nothing but endure. Their world had shrunk to the size of their cabin, their days measured by the twins' cries and the ticking of the clock. Compassion warred with fear, reason with superstition, hope with despair. And so I turn to you. If you were the doctor, standing in that shadowed room, would you trust in science, or would you heed the whispers of the old ways? Would you search for answers in your books, or in the patterns of dust and dreams? What would you do, faced with a mystery that defied explanation? Let me know in the comments, because sometimes the hardest questions are the ones we ask ourselves. In the dark, the investigation had begun, but the answers, if they existed at all, lay hidden in the spaces between worlds, waiting to be found or to be feared. The summer waned, and with it, the last fragile threads of hope in the McCreary household. The air grew heavy with the scent of dying leaves and distant smoke, and the world seemed to contract around the cabin, as if the land itself wished to forget what it had witnessed. The twins, once the promise of new life, had become the axis of a terror that no one could name, and the family's days blurred into a fevered twilight of dread and exhaustion. It was on a night when the moon hung low and red over the hills that the final, shattering revelation came. The day had been stifling, the air thick and unmoving, and Mary had spent it in a haze of worry, tending to Elisa's latest fever and watching Ephraim with a vigilance that bordered on obsession. John, gaunt and hollow-eyed, had taken to pacing the yard, his shotgun never far from reach, as if he could ward off the darkness with cold iron and will alone. That evening, as the sun bled out behind the trees, a strange hush fell over the land. The usual chorus of crickets and frogs was absent, replaced by a silence so deep it seemed to press against the windows. Mary, uneasy, lit every lamp in the house, their flickering flames casting long, uncertain shadows. She sang softly to the twins, her voice trembling, but Ephraim only stared at her, his eyes reflecting the lamplight in a way that made her shiver. John came in from the yard, his boots muddy, his face drawn. "Something's wrong," he whispered, though he could not say what. The air felt charged, as if a storm were gathering, though the sky outside was clear. The family huddled together, the twins between them, as the night deepened and the silence grew. It was just past midnight when the first sound came, a low, rhythmic thumping, like footsteps on wet earth. John stiffened, his hand tightening on the shotgun. Mary clutched the twins to her chest, her heart pounding. The sound grew louder, closer, until it seemed to come from beneath the floor itself. The lamps flickered, their flames guttering as a cold wind swept through the room. Then, without warning, the cradle where the twins slept began to rock violently, as if seized by invisible hands. Elisa whimpered, her feverish body trembling, but Ephraim sat up, his face eerily calm. He turned to Mary, his lips parting in a slow, deliberate smile, a smile that did not belong on the face of a child. The floorboards groaned, and a crack split the wood beneath the cradle. From the darkness below, a foul, earthy stench rose, filling the room with the scent of decay. John shouted, raising his gun, but the weapon felt useless, a toy in the face of something so ancient and implacable. The thumping grew louder, now accompanied by a chorus of whispers, voices speaking in a language no one in the room could understand, voices that seemed to come from the very bones of the house. Mary screamed as the crack widened, the cradle teetering on the edge. She lunged forward, grabbing Eliza, but Ephraim did not move. He stared into the darkness below, his eyes wide and unblinking, as if he recognized something in the void. The whispers rose to a fever pitch, swirling around the family, filling their ears with promises and threats, with secrets that no human mind was meant to hold. In that moment, time seemed to fracture. Mary saw, in a flash of impossible clarity, the history of the land, the blood spilled on the soil, the ancient rites performed in secret, the shadows that had always lingered at the edge of the woods. She saw herself, her family, the twins all caught in a web that stretched back generations, a pattern repeating itself over and over, each time growing darker, more twisted. John fired the shotgun into the crack, the blast deafening in the small room. The noise shattered the spell, and the whispers fell silent. The wind died, the lamps steadied, and the cradle stopped rocking. For a moment, there was only the sound of Mary's ragged breathing and the distant, mournful cry of an owl. But the damage was done. The crack in the floor remained, a jagged wound that would not heal. Ephraim slumped back in the cradle, his eyes closing, his body limp. Eliza sobbed in Mary's arms, her fever breaking at last. John dropped the gun, his hands shaking, his face wet with tears he could not explain. In the days that followed, the family tried to return to some semblance of normalcy, but nothing was the same. The crack in the floor resisted all attempts at repair, as if the house itself refused to forget. Ephraim grew weaker, his strange energy spent, while Eliza slowly recovered, her laughter returning in fits and starts. Mary and John spoke little of what had happened, each haunted by memories they could not share. The doctor visited one last time, his face grave. He examined the twins, listened to the family's halting account, and left without a word. In his journal, he wrote, "There are things in this world that defy explanation. The McCreary case will haunt me to my grave. I can only pray that whatever darkness visited that house has been satisfied, for now." The community, hearing rumors of the night's events, drew its own conclusions. Some said the family had driven out the evil with faith and courage. Others whispered that the darkness still lingered, waiting for another chance. The McCrearys became a cautionary tale, a story told in hushed tones around winter fires. But the truth, as always, was more complicated. The crack in the floor remained, a silent reminder of the night when the veil between worlds had thinned and something ancient had reached through. Ephraim's eyes, once so unsettling, now held only a distant sadness, as if he remembered things no child should know. Eliza, for all her recovery, sometimes woke in the night, her cries echoing the whispers that had filled the house. And so, the mystery endured. What had happened in the McCreary cabin that night? Was it a curse, a medical anomaly, or something older and darker than either? The answers, if they existed, lay buried in the silence, in the crack in the floor, in the memories of those who survived. Some questions, it seemed, were never meant to be answered. In the weeks that followed the night of the revelation, the McCreary family moved through their days like ghosts, their lives marked by a silence that was deeper than grief. The crack in the floor, impossible to mend, became a wound at the heart. Of the house a reminder of the night when the world had shifted and nothing could ever be the same. The air inside the cabin was heavy, as if the walls themselves remembered, holding their breath in anticipation of something neither Mary nor John could name. Ephraim, once the center of so much fear and fascination, faded into a quiet, watchful child. His strange energy was gone, replaced by a solemn stillness. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his words were simple, almost childlike, as if some part of him had been left behind in the darkness. Eliza, for her part, recovered her health, but not her innocence. She clung to Mary, waking often in the night, her dreams haunted by shadows and whispers. The bond between the twins, once mysterious and unsettling, became a fragile thread, one that held them together, but also set them apart from the world. John threw himself into his work, desperate to restore a sense of order to the farm. He patched fences, tilled the fields, and tried to ignore the way the crops still struggled, the way the animals eyed the house with suspicion. He spoke little, his laughter gone, his eyes always searching the horizon for a sign that the worst was truly over. Mary, meanwhile, became a shadow of her former self. She moved through her days with a quiet determination, tending to her children, keeping the lamps burning through the night, and avoiding the crack in the floor as if it might open again at any moment. The community, for all its talk of faith and righteousness, bore its own scars. The story of the McCreary twins became a cautionary tale, a whispered warning to children and a source of unease for adults. Some claimed the family had brought the darkness upon themselves, while others insisted they had been victims of forces beyond their understanding. The preacher's sermons grew softer, less certain, as if he too had glimpsed something that shook the foundations of his belief. The doctor, once a man of science and certainty, became withdrawn, his hair greying, his hands unsteady. He never spoke of the case again, but those who knew him best said he was never the same. Word of the McCreary twins eventually reached the wider world, carried by letters and rumors to distant towns and cities. The case was discussed in hushed tones among doctors and scholars, some of whom dismissed it as rural superstition, while others saw in it a challenge to the limits of their knowledge. A few medical journals published brief clinical accounts, stripped of the fear and wonder that had gripped the family and their neighbors. But the truth of what had happened, terror, the mystery, the sense of something ancient and unknowable, remained locked within the walls of the McCreary cabin. For Mary and John, the psychological toll was immeasurable. They had faced the unthinkable and survived, but survival came at a cost. Their trust in the world, in their community, and even in themselves had been shaken. They lived with the knowledge that some questions have no answers, that some wounds never heal, and that the past can reach forward, shaping the present in ways both subtle and profound. The twins grew, but the shadow of that summer never fully left them. Ephraim remained quiet, his eyes always searching the darkness, while Eliza grew into a thoughtful, watchful girl, her laughter tinged with sadness. The family learned to live with the unknown, to carry their story in silence, even as the world moved on around them. And what of the land itself? Some said the McCreary farm was cursed, that nothing would ever grow there again. Others claimed to see strange lights in the woods at night, or to hear whispers on the wind when the moon was full. The crack in the floor remained, a silent witness to the night when the veil between worlds had thinned, and something had slipped through. If you've ever felt haunted by an unsolved mystery, if you've ever lain awake at night, wondering what really happened, or felt the chill of something you couldn't explain, share your story below. The McCreary twins' tale is not just a story of one family, but of all of us, and the shadows we carry. Some mysteries are never solved. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. And sometimes, the only thing we can do is remember and wonder, and keep the lamps burning against the dark. The story of the McCreary twins lingers, not just as a tale of terror, but as a mirror held up to the deepest corners of the human mind. In the flickering candlelight of that Kentucky cabin, we see the struggle that has haunted humanity for centuries. The desperate need to understand, to explain, to bring order to chaos. Science, with its instruments and theories, offers comfort, a promise that every shadow can be measured, every anomaly named. Yet, as the McCrearys learned, there are places where reason falters, where the unknown refuses to yield to the light. Fear, too, is a force as old as time. It binds communities together, but it can also tear them apart. The McCreary family's ordeal was shaped as much by the suspicions and superstitions of their neighbors as by the strange events themselves. When faced with the inexplicable, people often reach for the oldest stories, the simplest answers: witchcraft, curses, the wrath of God. These explanations may soothe the mind, but they can also breed isolation, cruelty, and a deeper kind of darkness. And yet, who among us has not felt that same fear? Who has not lain awake at night, heart pounding, wondering what moves in the shadows just beyond our understanding? The need for answers is a hunger that drives us forward, but it is also a burden. Sometimes, the search for truth leads to revelation. Other times, it opens doors that can never be closed. The McCreary twins' story leaves us with questions that echo far beyond the hills of Kentucky. What do we do when science fails us? When the world refuses to make sense? Do we cling to faith, or do we accept that some things are simply unknowable? Is it better to keep searching, or to let certain mysteries remain in the dark? Are some mysteries better left unsolved? I invite you to reflect on these questions, to share your thoughts and your own stories in the comments below. Have you ever encountered something you couldn't explain? Did you seek answers, or did you turn away? In the end, perhaps it is not the answers that matter most, but the courage to face the unknown and the wisdom to know when to let it be. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the shadows of Kentucky's pastor. Story that still echoes with unanswered questions and uneasy truths. If you've made it this far, you're among the rare few who have looked darkness in the eye and refused to turn away. Stories like the McCreary twins remind us that history is not just a collection of dates and names, but a living, breathing thing full of secrets, fears, and mysteries that refuse to be forgotten. If this tale left you unsettled, or if it sparked memories of your own brushes with the unknown, I invite you to share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. This channel is a place for those who aren't afraid to ask hard questions, to dig deeper, and to wonder what lies just beyond the edge of the firelight. Your stories, your theories, and your debates are what keep this community alive. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a journey into the strange and the forgotten. Every week, we explore the darkest corners of history, the mysteries that science can't explain, and the stories that linger long after the last page is turned. And if you thought the tale of the McCreary twins was chilling, just wait. The next story is even stranger. You dare join us. Until then, keep your lamps burning, your minds open, and remember, some mysteries are waiting for you in the dark.